Professor Chomsky, could we start by listening to you explain what the propaganda model, as you call it, is? For many people, the idea that propaganda is used by democratic rather than merely authoritarian governments will be a strange one.
Well, the term propaganda fell into disfavor at around the Second World War, but in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was commonly used and, in fact, advocated, not by leading intellectuals, by the founders of modern political science, by Wilsonian progressives, and, of course, by the public relations industry, as a necessary technique to overcome the danger of democracy. The institutional structure of the media is quite straightforward. We're talking about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere. There are sectors, but the agenda-setting media, the ones that sort of set the framework for everyone else, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, these are major corporations, parts of even bigger conglomerates. Like other corporate institutions, they have a product and a market. Their market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. Their product is relatively privileged audiences, more or less.
So they're selling audiences to
They're selling privileged audience. These are big corporations selling privileged audiences to other corporations. Now the question is, what picture of the world would a rational person expect to come out of this structure? Then we draw some conclusions about what you'd expect, and then we check, and yes, that's the picture of the world that comes out.
And is this anything more than the idea that basically the press is relatively right-wing, with some exceptions, because it's owned by big business, which is a truism, is well known?
Well, I would call the press relatively liberal. Here I agree with the right-wing critics. So especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are called, without a trace of irony, the New York Times is called the establishment left in, say, major foreign policy journals. And that's correct, but what's not recognized is that the role of the liberal intellectual establishment is to set very sharp bounds on how far you can go. This far and no further.
Give me some examples of that.
Well, let's take, say, the Vietnam War. Probably the leading critic, and in fact one of the leading dissident intellectuals in the mainstream, is Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who did finally come around to opposing the Vietnam War about 1969, about a year and a half after corporate America had more or less ordered Washington to call it off. And his picture from then on is that the war, as he put it, began with blundering efforts to do good, but it ended up by 1969 being a disaster and costing us too much.
So what would the non-propaganda model have told Americans about the Vietnam War at the same time?
Same thing that the mainstream press was telling them about Afghanistan. The United States first of all, in the 1950s, it set up a standard Latin American-style terror state, which had massacred tens of thousands of people, but was unable to control a local uprising, and everyone knows, at least every specialist knows that's what it was. And when Kennedy came in 1961, they had to make a decision because the government was collapsing under local attack, so the U.S. just invaded the country. In 1961, the U.S. Air Force started bombing South Vietnamese civilians, authorized napalm, crop destruction. Then in 1965, February 1965, the next major escalation took place against South Vietnam, not against North Vietnam. That was a sideshow. That's what an honest press would be saying, but you can't find a trace of it.
Now, if the press is a
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist and barbecue social media reviewer David Griscom.
Hell yeah. How's it going?
Cool, yeah. Good. On this week's program, Joshua Kahn Russell. He's the executive director of the Wildfire Project. He's one of our regulars, part of our crew, our familia. We're talking about resiliency, strategies for how the left can actually win, the inner capacities that the left needs to overcome some of its toxic internal culture, and how to actually turn your anxiety into action. Very much looking forward to this conversation. Usually he's in studio, but he will be joining us over Skype from California. We're going deep Unfortunately, Alona Minkowski is ill, so she is not going to be in tonight, but we will be seeing her very soon and at the February 7th live show. But before then, she'll be in before then. But it's nasty out here and people getting sick all over the place. It's actually terrifying, to be honest. So we wish her a speedy recovery. We're still talking about the Democratic Congress giving Donald Trump his Space Force, a military authorization that does nothing on Yemen, Iran, the authorization for military force resolution. None of it. Not even arms control. Such a cool noise. Isn't that unbelievable? It's like the old shows, the lasers. We're going to... Incredible. I said, Mike, listen to this. We're going to be doing that. Evo Morales speaks to Glenn Greenwald about the coup in Bolivia and the ongoing nature of U.S. hegemony in the region. We'll be reviewing that in the post-game. Protests erupt across India against the Modi government's occupation of Kashmir and broader efforts to strip away Muslim rights and citizenship. Facebook and a new propaganda model. How do we actually understand how these things work beyond the hysteria? Plus, a new human rights report on what's been happening in Chile as demonstrations are ongoing there. And bad. The New York Times does more than anybody else ever could to destroy its reputation as they... I don't even know if smear is the right word, what they did to Cenk Uygur. We'll be talking about them and their incredible own goals. Ben Burgess and I will be debunking the medical innovation myth used against Medicare for all. And of course, we have a gem. What are we talking about on the gem?
The global debt crisis.
Global debt crisis. Cheerio. Don't worry, we'll be making fun of Meghan McCain later. It's fine.
I was meant for the debt crisis, but it works for McCain too.
We got it. It works in all ways. I want to do some type of longitudinal study on marijuana intake versus sound drop innovation with you. I'm genuinely curious. No, not like that. It's a major benefit to the show, and I'm really curious. Some days you are extremely loose with it. Other days you almost make me like Sam. I'm over here like, Matt, sound drop. And you're like checking your phone. And then other days you're doing a whole other Fred Norris style parallel story for the entire show with the sound drops.
Did a hell of a job of your job.
That's what I say to these guys every night. And I sound exactly like that after the show. All right. But first, we got to talk about what happens in the United Kingdom, which we spoke a lot about on this show. I felt it was important because the election mattered a lot, and there's very little alternative and independent media infrastructure in the UK, with some obvious exceptions, including one example is Tribune Magazine, which I would recommend everybody support. In fact, if you're a member of the New Statesman, quit that, join Tribune. Immediately. Jesus Christ, please. It was always going to be an uphill battle. Jeremy Corbyn had very, very, very negative ratings with the public. The polls always showed the Tories winning. The question was how much could the margin be cut? Could it be cut enough to deny a Tory majority? And of course, the answer is the following. It was a disaster. Boris Johnson now has a 78-seat majority to impose his agenda. Labour lost 59 seats. And the most important aspect of the loss was Labour's losing its long-standing base in the north of England. Early data shows that many Labour voters stayed home in its traditional areas. In some close elections, Lib Dem voters split the vote between Labour, allowing Conservative MPs to win with small margins. But the Lib Dems, an independent group, were defeated handily across the country, which is an important thing for people on the so-called center to remind themselves. The Labour Party had a disastrous night. There's no use in trying to deny that, but they still exist as a party. The political path you're advocating literally destroyed one formation almost entirely, and the Lib Dems had a catastrophic evening and really only prove that their only function are as of wreckers of any type of viable center-left to left coalition. Now, we need to be real about how this happened from the labor side, and also, I think, much more strategic and intelligent about understanding what Boris Johnson did. It's not enough to just call him another Trump or a fascist or any of these types of things. And I think the reason that we need to be more precise and not just kind of throw around verbiage is because we need to actually beat these people. We need to actually have a strategy to confront them. And we need to think critically about how they were able to pull off what they pulled off. But first, let's talk about the problems inside labor. Are we all good? Okay. Brexit undoubtedly made the election incredibly difficult. However, and we're still seeing polling coming out of this election that we need to determine exactly why people stayed home. There's things that might even be more disturbing for those of us that want to push a progressive liberatory agenda, particularly in the United Kingdom. Some polls indicated that traditional labor voters didn't believe the math added up, as an example, on the Labour Party manifesto. Others have emphasized the fact that there wasn't a clear, coherent message as there was in 2017. There wasn't a great slogan like the many, not the few, that encapsulated a policy manifesto. It was a bunch of promises across a wide range of policies, most of which were individually popular, all of which were absolutely necessary and also scored out and legitimate, but the media obviously was dishonest about it. But the other thing that we can't get around is Brexit. And I think at this point, we have to really seriously ask ourselves whether or not the Labour Party capitulating to the liberal consensus on Brexit was a major tactical and strategic mistake. I want to be clear that I'm setting aside whether or not Brexit was the right call. I think there's a great left case against the European Union, but it was not the case that was running the Brexit campaign, and it is certainly not the Singapore-Dubai model that the Tories want to implement on the UK. Is not what the left was talking about. However, Brexit passed, and opinion polls never showed that people had been flipped on it. Chances are, if people voted again, it would pass again. That is a very high likelihood. In 2017, among other things that the Labour Party did, including putting out another great aggressive manifesto and going to the streets, was say, look, this is the vote. We're going to respect it, and we're going to fight for the best deal possible. But we are going to respect the vote. And Paul O'Connell, who's a very insightful writer in the UK, has really convinced me that moving from that position to try to appease liberal forces in London who spent every other day smearing and undermining the Labour Party leadership was a strategic fool's errand that enhanced a lack of credibility with the traditional labor base. There was a lack of willingness to understand what the Brexit vote meant, and instead, hard Remainers were able to present a caricature of these voters, and now Boris Johnson has free range to push forward his free market-oriented NHS, almost certainly NHS destroying Brexit strategy. But we'll get to him in a moment. Many pro-Brexit voters who voted Labour traditionally claim their vote was to regain control over their own lives. After Thatcher and then Blair's continuation of Thatcher's policies, who can blame them? The failure to speak out on this and recognize this was a huge blunder that Johnson used to his advantage. And this is another thing that Rory Burton-Shaw has pointed out, that the policy set was right in terms of what Labour was putting on the table, but they were not able to rebuild an organic relationship with core voting constituencies. That was a major problem. And then they sort of would go back with this enormous enthusiasm being generated in downwardly mobile youth, which is an important part of the coalition, but that is not going to be a substitute for a countrywide strategy to reclaim your voters and mobilize your voters. The Labour Party should have held the 2017 position that almost brought them into power instead of retreating to appease centrists and managerial class voters because of fear of losing them to the Lib Dems. The manifesto was very popular, but there was a disconnect, and voters who felt ignored by the party didn't have much reason to believe the party would show up for them. Also, what did Boris Johnson do right? Well, again, let's be real. we see from poll after poll after poll that there is some form that the so-called center of most electorates is the opposite of what is pushed forward by elite media. It's some version of quote-unquote socially conservative and at least somewhat economically left. Now, what these terms actually mean when you drill down into them is radically different things for different people. Some segments are people that are actually really quite economically oppressive. They don't like some aspects of annoying liberal culture and uptightness and language policing or whatever, but they actually do have a strong commitment to core issues of civil rights and equity. Those are people that can be mobilized and spoken to very effectively. Then obviously there's other people in bases of parties like the Republican Party or the Tory Party who absolutely are voting on a base of xenophobia and racism. And we need to be able to distinguish those things. But the bottom line is that Boris Johnson was able to both exploit xenophobia and racism, also in other ways. And again, this is something the left needs to be a lot more strategic about. If you went and you had a conversation with a normal voter in the UK, they would say, what are you talking about? Boris Johnson was the mayor of London, where he defended minority rights and marched in the LGBTQ parade. He has the most diverse cabinet in UK history and is not promising to end immigration. He's actually promising to have a neoliberal system that would incentivize people with higher job skills, right? That's what he was actually doing. And then also promising huge investments in the NHS, biggest public service investments since the Blair era, where there was actually a great deal of investment. And in fact, along with the privatizations that New Labour tried to do, you might see something very similar in the Boris Johnson era in terms of more money, but more private influence. So we need to be really savvy about knowing the grounds we're fighting on and what appeals to people, and where, when we don't appeal to people, we need to have an argument on the merits and the principles. We need to not confuse that with posturing or going on fool's errands that will be complete electoral catastrophes and in fact end up hurting, as an example, migrants who are targeted by all of these governments. We need to be very strategic and serious about this. And I think one step, particularly with Boris Johnson and that government, is understanding the game they played, because it was a sinister and extremely savvy game, way more savvy than Trump. Way more savvy than Trump. If there was a Boris Johnson approach to Republican Party politics in the United States, it could govern for decades. We need to figure out how to beat it. Now, fortunately, in the United States, we have actually some very different dynamics at play, and this is something that you're going to need to use to push back against all of the people in the Democratic Party establishment and elite who are lying about and distorting this result. Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn are similar in the sense that they're two noble figures who are better people than a vast majority of people in politics. And they actually care about human beings, okay? And they have some actual principles and commitments. So there are similarities there. We don't want to get away from them, and I also don't want to get away from actually, in fact, honoring the many incredibly noble and important things that Corbyn has done as leader of the Labour Party. And he should not quit immediately either, in fact, because the last thing we want is just simply a Blairite takeover. But let's be real. Johnson led Corbyn in every single poll leading up to the election. Personal popularity showed Corbyn polling at negative 40% in some polls. Bernie Sanders is generally popular with Americans, including 44% favorability ratings and 75% among Democrats. This was recently released as well. And again, politics is polarized as it is today. 44 is a high number, believe it or not. We are defining ourselves against years of disappointment by the Democratic Party in the U.S. We're not reclaiming space, we're creating it. This gives Bernie much more space to move, and he's thought of as an outsider who's trying to change politics and promote a new brand of politics. There will be similarities in terms of facing a uniformly hostile oligarchy in media that will be relentlessly biased against Bernie, and you're already actually seeing the attempt to do the anti-Semitism thing against the possibly first Jewish president of the United States, which is an incredible piece of jiu-jitsu and would be funny if it wasn't so disgusting, but watch out for it. And you can't give these people an inch on anything across the board. If you're going to endorse Cenk, keep the endorsement and defend Linda Sarsour. Because any of these moves, any of these capitulations is weakness that will just be exploited for further gain. You have to plant your flag in the ground and fight it clearly and vigorously. We need to be prepared to hit back hard on every front. And I think another advantage the United States has is a much broader independent media, which we are actually a very important part of in terms of pushing back against the overall sort of propaganda operation. And then dwarfing all of that is grassroots organizing, ground game, in a way that directly translates to real people's material needs in every circumstance across the country. If you are knocking in Iowa or Brooklyn or Alabama or New Jersey, people are going to be asking about housing, healthcare, and other issues like that. And you can put forward very clearly that Bernie Sanders is the superior choice on every. He also polls well against Donald Trump. And that's another major, major difference. We can't forget our base. Bernie's message is popular with a broad multiracial working class coalition, and we need to continue to grow that coalition and not worrying about appeasing professional managerial types. And again, for people who get touchy about this, yes, we're all part of that. If you're listening to this, you might very well be part of that class, but there is an ethos and there is a certain set of political neurosis that can't be appeased. Because ironically, it will just lose. I would be the first person to tell you if I thought that there was a conflict between the most desirable candidate to be elected and what could actually win. I think we need to be intellectually honest about this. I think in the United States, we're in an interesting position where the best candidate on the merits is actually either the first or second best candidate to take on and defeat Donald Trump. So you see a lot of people who discourse this pragmatism going out of their way to back candidates that I am legitimately petrified would be destroyed by Donald Trump. And I say this as somebody who takes beating Donald Trump incredibly seriously. And I will not be playing about, oh no, another 4 years of having fucking Nazis at the Homeland Security Department or wherever else is actually good for us. It's not. And it's not good for the most vulnerable people either. But we need to be real with actual reality in order to confront it and change it. And that's what we can learn from the UK moving forward in all of our political endeavors. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I actually would really like to, say that people like Grace Blakely and Paul O'Connell have been fighting an uphill battle for the past couple of years, and they've been really unfairly attacked by a lot of people. And just ultimate solidarity for them for pointing out something that they thought was true turned out to be true.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that should be acknowledged.
You're right.
But but the thing is, we can still learn from that message. Like, Brexit was something that the Labour Party and the left in general sort of did not take advantage of, trying to fill that space of what that meant. And they allowed the right wing to do it, and they allowed the centrists also to characterize it as something, rather than as something that could be a potential opportunity, because it's going to happen now, right? So it's they need to prepare, and there needs to be a plan for how we're going to deal with that reality. But I would just like to add one important thing about the working class, because we're going to be hearing that, there's so many people talking about what is the working class in the UK? And that's going to be the big question going forward. People on our side, first of all, people, the centrists, the center left, they take those people for granted constantly. And we're seeing that revolt happening across the globe. People on our side, too, have a very difficult time recognizing that the fact that the working class is a very important category of socialism, but it also is not a ready-made political category. It's filled with lots of different contradictions, lots of different movements, lots of different opinions. So when we're seeing that there's a conflict within working class movements, for example, some people in certain parts of the UK, wanting to remain and others wanting to leave, we shouldn't say, oh, well, these people are voting against their interests. We should rather say, why is the interest of this group this? How can we deal with that? And, what's the way to go forward? Instead of just trying to talk down to people and say something like, oh, well, you don't know what's best for you, I do. That's not a way to build a coalition. It's also not a very Marxist or theoretical way to look at the world. The world is riddled with contradictions, and the duty of our political position is actually to be able to work through those contradictions, not just expect the world to be some kind of ready-made instrument that we're going to be able to pick up for the mantle of socialism.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And I think disaggregating between when you have to accept that a broader part of a coalition disagrees with you is one thing, is separate from trying to impose a small set of cultural manners and preferences, which is not even politics, on a whole block of people is another thing and innately a problem, is a totally different thing from, all right, we're 1 in 99, but this might be a matter of principle that we have to just stand on and fight whatever may. Those three things are conflated in left politics constantly in a disastrous and delusional way. Those are really different things. So Brexit passed. What's a left strategy for Brexit, even if you think it's the wrong call, is the thoughtful, strategic, and non-arrogant way of approaching it. And distinguish, and then the other two categories. And so, and then there's like, oh, but I'm going to force the people in the Middle England to have my habits, my beliefs, my social attitudes. No, and then that is totally different than. If there's a broad coalescing on certain just simply inhumane and vicious migration policies, we will fight them, even if that is unpopular. And those are three different lanes. And you need to know what lane you're fighting on and talking about and not confuse those two things of power politics, where you win some and lose some, cultural values and attitudes that are just yours. They're not there for, nobody should be colonizing other people with that. Everybody should actually be a lot more free and a lot more open and a lot more, I hate to use the word, libertarian, frankly, in a way. And then the third point, when you have to, battle on the merits. Those are three different things. I really want to underline that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to hit really quickly and say, another group that we have to hit too are like the idiotic position that the solution out of this is some kind of merging of like right-wing social conservatism and like racism with economic politics, like the blue labor people, that kind of movement. That is not like what we're talking about either.
It's not what we're talking about. It's definitely not what we're talking about. Although I will say I'm very wary now when I see, so I read enough of the blue labor thing to know that that's not what we're talking about. But I also know that any single person, including like a Mark Blythe, who says a lot of people identify on some level with the nation state, that's going to get back into the objectively true, and you got to deal with the category. Because I'm not going to spend the next 50 years while the world is run by these people going, you just really need to give that. I mean, I'm sorry, it's just not reality. It's not what it is. You have to cultivate internationalism, but you also have to deal with a lot of things that, people might find meaningful, and you have to figure out a positive mechanism for them. Because we're not going to skip over that. I don't see it. And I'm serious about actually winning.
You have to build that consciousness too, not just expect it from people.
And then your consciousness will also be built by those interactions.
Absolutely.
And then maybe you might actually build a more nuanced perspective on what these things are as well, if it's an actual dialectic relationship. All right, let's do a few more things, then we will get to Joshua Kahn Russell. We're running very late, but this is important stuff. We're going to do the pitch first, because we have a new website, and I'm really excited about this. I want to thank Adam Hadut for helping put this together. I want to thank David Alexander for being a really super great guy and photographer. Everybody check out his work.
Yeah, shout out David.
Yeah, shout out David. Thank you so much for coming in here and working with us. We might be doing some more stuff. Go to the menu, Matt. So scroll down first. Let's give them the whole tour of the site before we go to the menu. So these are tees. These are union made. You can order them. There is because these are on pre-sale and we're going to ship them out sometime in January. There is a pre-sale code that you can use to get the 10% off. And I'm totally missing it. I believe it's pre-sale 10 is the one, but I'm going to double check it. Then there's become a member. That's an amazing photo. That's Lula in the 80s in Brazil. That will take you to our Patreon page. Then there are descriptions of our most recent shows as well. And then if you scroll back up, you can go to the menu, and there's a section on the upcoming book. As an example, that will be filled in. We've got our blurbs there if you want to read who the book has been blurbed by, and we'll be having graphics up there soon as well. you can also see our upcoming events, live shows. That's at the bottom. And then you can click on that and go get your tickets to February 7th at the Bell House, where we will be live with Pretty Bad Lefty, Brandon Sutton, Alona Minkowski, Ben Burgess, Harvey K, and Matt Binder, who they have still not put on the website.
Shout out Matt Binder.
So that is what we got there. I would recommend you grab your tickets to the live show and start getting your merch. We've got hoodies and tees. The hoodies cannot be produced by the union place. So those are, and this took a huge amount of effort. It's actually crazy. I learned a lot about this world. Those are fair wage, benefit paid, and fully assembled inside the United States. And then all of the other ones are union made inside the United States. So that is also, that's part of what the price point is too. It seemed a little contradictory to go make them in a sweatshop in Bangladesh. But we are really proud of it and really happy and excited to start moving those. It really helps the show, obviously. And then, of course, we want to get to 100,000 subs on YouTube. I think we could hit 94,000 tonight. We actually could hit 100,000 if all of you who are watching would just hit subscribe. So just hit subscribe. It actually helps a lot. And then the bell notification for live streams. I do extra live streams as well. Guys, let's talk about Sunday shows and why people should become patrons now at patreon.com/TMBS.
I mean, one, we offer so much extra content, but I know that there's a think tank coming up that we just recorded recently. It's going to be a very interesting deep dive into, dialectical materialism and a lot of different Marxist concepts. These think tanks that we do are really fun. We source questions from our patrons, and then we're able to discuss them, take a little bit of a deeper dive into, kind of the more headier, more up in the clouds kind of questions that we face.
People should check out the recent episode we did with Megan Day on the housing policies of both Bernie and then Ilhan's elaboration of it, maybe, or I don't know how you'd characterize it. But yeah, really good. I mean, we're kind of past the point of like the policy fetishization of it, but these are actually worth getting familiar with. So check those out.
Definitely non-reform reforms. All right, we're a little bit off segment here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the shout out after we talk to Joshua Kahn Russell. I'm going to take a brief break and call him right now, and we'll be back in about a minute. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. I have to say, we have the best people, and Adam has just informed me it's pre-sale 10, the number 10. Put that in on all of your purchases and get 10% off before we start shipping in January. I'm honored and privileged now to introduce our good friend and mentor and Paisan, Joshua Kahn Russell. He's the executive director of the Wildfire Project. Joshua, thanks so much for calling in. By the way, on video, this is the first time we've ever done this for the main show. Is everything working?
Woo!
Joshua, thank you for being here.
Hey, y'all. So grateful to be here.
So, Joshua, I noticed maybe more than you'd expect. And I think in some ways it's very cool because it means that there is this kind of nice internationalist ethos. But this UK election hit people really hard. And I think it hit people hard because it's a terrible result and, a party that was actually putting forward some really good policies, and there was real integrity about them in terms of their commitments, got trashed. And there's the obvious reason. I think the deeper reason, and this is just me pontificating, is that we're all processing kind of multiple crises constantly. Right. And then so much of, and obviously I think this show and things like this are enormously helpful as in some sense, but people, there's still a huge amount of taking in trauma and then sitting around and processing it on social media, which is the opposite of where you should go to clear your head and sort of think more effectively. In fact, they're basically capitalist predator corporations that incentivize all of the worst of human behavior. So I want to talk with you as somebody who I think both by experience and temperament and thought process, knows how to filter this sense of anxiety into action, and action with results, not just action. So big picture though, could you reflect on that first? Like why people might be in such a state of like heightened anxiety and all of the shit we actually are processing?
Yeah. Way to dive right in there. Yeah, I mean, that's how I came to, you asked me to come on and talk about spirit, which I've been excited to do. And this is actually my first time coming out of the closet spiritually in a way. And for me, I came up in the secular left, and I had the rigor of ideology as a compass to navigate the world. And particularly coming up in the climate justice movement and having my head in the realities of the science, the realities that we live in, we're living in the 6th great extinction in our planet, that all the systems that support life on this planet are in free fall or collapse. I had to find a way to handle taking in the constant bad news without shutting down, and without moving into kind of the liberal individualist self-care paradigm either. Right. And, so it forced me into opening up spiritually, really. Actually, let me take a step back and just share. I know I've shared a little bit of my personal story on the show before, but, I spent the first kind of 15, 20 years of my organizing life just sprinting. And the intellectual and analytical tools that the left gave me were very useful, but they were all cerebral. And I lost access to my body's wisdom. I lost access to my spirit's wisdom. I lost access to my heart's wisdom. And I didn't have a way to grapple with the scale of change that's underway. And in that process, I hit a wall. I became completely bedridden for 3 years, and I found a spiritual pathway out of that. And in doing so, realized that actually the secularism of the left is one of the barriers that we have to fight, because, you brought up sort of the despair of the UK elections. One of the things that engaging spirit has taught me is that faith is actually the opposite of fear, and that all revolutionaries have to be grounded in a tremendous amount of faith. And we can talk more about that, but just to kind of set the table, the organization that I work with now, the Wildfire Project, we have a very pragmatic approach to trying to assess what are the internal barriers within the culture of the left that are holding us back from winning power. What are the patterns that we're stuck in? And we came out of that assessment with a list of kind of 6 different elements.
Can we? I want to get to that in 1 minute, but before I do, let me help all of our secular materialist friends that are watching and listening and just getting like totally freaked out by all the words you're throwing around. What is a way that, first of all, what do some of those things actually practically mean? And without watering it down, I'm into highlighting a really wide range of beliefs about this stuff because I think it's actually really important and worthwhile, obviously. But I also know that you're not talking about kind of like insipid New Ageism. And I also know that you're not talking about something that if somebody chooses to process it in a materialized or secular way that they can't. So I just want you to kind of spell that out a little bit more, and then we're going to go into a very practical process that you use in Wildfire. Yeah.
So the practices that we build with the social movements that we serve are all grounded. We learn from spiritual traditions, but none of these are theistic. You don't need to believe in God to be, for example, grounded in gratitude. I'll just start off with gratitude, right? Which is that on the left, we are often trained, I was certainly trained, to see things in a binary as good or bad, liberatory or oppressive, right or wrong, to do all this value signaling to demonstrate that you're on the righteous side of things, etc. And as a result, we build a cerebral lens where our brains that are wired for pattern recognition are taught to deconstruct everything and see what's wrong with everything. And then we take that neurological architecture to our internal organizations. And our organizations suffer from chronic internal critique that doesn't go anywhere, that's not solution oriented and not visionary, because we train our brains to see what's wrong rather than paying attention to and feeding what's going well. And so the simple practice of, in your organization, if you do a go round of expressing why you're grateful for each other, why you're grateful for your accomplishments, why you're grateful for the current political landscape, it helps us soften, it helps us release, hypervigilance and doubt and scarcity, and helps us actually step into vision. So that's one example of Wildfire outlines a number of practices that you don't need. You can totally have a secular mindset and engage. It just so happens that there's a depth of insight that comes out of spiritual traditions on these kinds of topics.
Definitely. I mean, that's something, and I think actually, I mean, for all of my fun with trolling, I have a very secular worldview, but I'm also somebody who absolutely knows for a fact that some of these traditions deliver serious inner capacity building. And that does correlate directly with strategic capacity in the language of that kind of work, and also always seems to neatly correlate with all of the problem, like the vampire castle stuff and all of the just, again, not just sort of sometimes people misjudge when we talk about it. Yes, there's a cultural critique, and yes, a lot of the tendencies are annoying and not my preference. And so we critique them, and that's fine. That's part of it. But the bigger picture, and what Wildfire and you identify, is that this stuff is what makes these movements susceptible to destruction. Yeah, this is what makes, at a time when you literally need a left that has the capability to actually achieve things and has an opportunity to achieve things in a time of incredible danger, handicapped and held back and destroyed. So this actually has serious implications. And I want to just keep moving then, because you brought up gratitude, but you also have several other practices that you guys work with internally. And just, can you talk about those practices and maybe also give people, again, a sense, because there's definitely new people on this ride, of what kind of organizations that you have worked with and that Wildfire works with specifically?
Yeah. So the Wildfire Project serves organizations across sectors. So we work with Black liberation struggles, immigration, rights issues, climate change, indigenous sovereignty, housing justice, economic justice, and labor. And part of our mission is to break down the silos between those things. And in doing so, we support organizations to be more powerful, to get over, the self-limiting bullshit that the left teaches us. That part of our assessment is that we have all these barriers in front of us that are outside of our control, but the biggest barrier that's within our control is the culture of the left itself. And that one of the reasons for that is that this being in late stage capitalism at this moment means that in the United States, we have such a hyper individualized culture that we don't know how to be in groups together. And that learning how to be in a group together where you can exercise agency over the control of your life is fundamental to navigating the transition that's upon us with the ecological crisis and the political crises that we're in. And so it's really just learning how to be in groups together. And there's all these things that get kind of relegated to this dimension of spirit, and I'm so glad you're demystifying it, because all of the new age woo-woo stuff does us such a disservice. So I'll give a couple examples of one that Griscom mentioned earlier in the show is about contradictions. That one thing spiritual traditions can teach us is the capacity to hold multiple truths and to be able to sit in contradiction and to not have one right answer. To be in for example, the spiritual truth that we're all one, and the material truth that our differences really matter, right? And so increasing our capacity to sit in contradiction helps us understand and navigate dialectics. I think, you can't understand hegemony without navigating the way that spirit has been colonized by religion. And I know that's a little bit, maybe I just threw a curveball. We can talk about it later.
Yeah.
But building our capacity in our organizations to hold multiple truths is necessary to assess the reality of our landscape and not be seduced by conflating all of our opposition as the same. For example, I see a lot of the analysis on this show doing that exact project, which is why I brought it up first. Another one is keeping the real big picture in mind, being able to locate yourself in a historical trajectory of the arc of liberation that you're in so that you're not so overwhelmed by the particular moment that you're in. So a lot of spiritual traditions look back to ancestors and look back to building on the infrastructure that's been built before us by social movements, and keeping the real big picture in mind helps us do that. Another one is the capacity to surrender, which is something that leftists hate to hear about, because one thing that religion has robbed us of is religion teaches people to submit. Right. And we then, leftists, then confuse submission with surrender. And surrender is actually a liberatory practice that allows you to identify what's within your capacity to change, what's beyond your capacity to change, and being strategic about where you put your energy so you don't burn out, freaking out about all the stuff that you can't control. It's a very practical way of deciding how you set goals as an organization, for an example. I have a lot more of these. I'll pause now before I keep going.
I actually like, and then there was, can we talk about drawing on untapped resources and sources of resilience, and then an increased sense of interdependence? Can you cover those two?
Yeah. So, both of those, I guess the first thing I would say is that everyone that I know who's engaged in political struggle, we're all trying to figure out how to be in community in the context of late stage capitalism. We're all alienated from our context. And one of the things that...
Sorry, actually, really quick. I'm really sorry. Yeah. This is another one, and I'm guilty of this all the time. And so it's wrong that I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm doing it anyways. What does late stage capitalism mean to you? This is another one of these terms that we throw around a lot. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's that the limitations of a system of endless expansion are bouncing up with the ecological boundaries of the life systems that support life on this planet. Yeah. And so we are at those limits right now. We are alive at that stage. And so there's a lot of implications of what that means. And for me, what it means is how do we re-relate to land, to each other, to the social commons when the commons have been fully eaten up and colonized by capital. We are at a place where the very land we stand on is privatized and owned. They're trying to privatize the air and the water. And so the very basis upon which human beings have built community for time immemorial is now owned and privatized. And that's a specific stage of human history. And it's occurring at the exact moment that the entire balance of our ecosystem is going out of whack. And in doing so, is pressuring our economic systems, our political systems, our social systems, and all the limitations of the individualistic alienation of capitalism are coming to a head, which is why our society is so depressed, which is why, all the things you talk about on the show all the time. And so that's my answer to that question.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I'll get you back to, okay, draw on untapped resources and sources of resilience and increase a sense of interdependence.
Yeah. One of the things that indigenous movements and Black movements in particular in this country are leading with is in the way that they talk about their relationship to ancestors. They are locating themselves within a larger trajectory of history that helps us ground this historical moment. I was just today, I was facilitating a workshop today for an environmental organization. And on my way there, I was listening to the post game from your show last week, and you played that Cornel West clip. And Cornel West was making the point that on one hand, this moment of neo-fascism is specific. And it is intense and it is overwhelming. And also white supremacy has been a through line through U.S. culture since the U.S. was founded as well. Right. And holding both it's important to locate yourself so that you don't get so overwhelmed that you think the challenges ahead of us are insurmountable. And so, one of the things that indigenous movements teach us, for example, is that when people freak out about the climate crisis, I think about apocalypse constantly. And apocalypse, the Greek, I don't like the etymology of doing the whatever word thing, but it does mean lifting the veil. And it does mean unmasking what's really there. And different movements have emerged through different apocalypses through human history. And there are movements that are grounded in having overcome apocalypse in the past. The genocide of 95% of Native people on this continent was an apocalypse, and there are people who lived through it who have insights about what that means. And when we're in a moment of civilizational transition and collapse, where there's an expanding circle of apocalypse, where the transition that we're in is more and more undeniable for more and more people. It reaches higher into the circles of privilege, and that there's a way we can locate ourselves within that, and that what Native movements are telling the rest of us is learning how to be in community, learning how to be in interdependence is the way forward. I was in a talk the other day where there were some Native elders on this panel, and people were asking, what's the thing that we can do to be resilient through climate change? What's the one? And the question was sort of rooted in policy. And the answer that was given was, well, it's to know your neighbors. It's to build neighborhood associations. It's so that when the power goes out, you know how to meet each other's needs. It's so when the hurricane hits, you know how to meet each other's needs. It's so that when food prices spike or skyrocket, you know how to meet each other's needs. And there's communities all throughout the U.S., whether that's New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, who have constantly experienced this. So part of what I think this work is demystifying the nature of apocalypse, to not think of the situation we're in as entirely, it's not that unique in human history in one way. And in another way, it's totally unique. That's another contradiction we have to hold.
And I think what's really interesting to me about that, actually, and this brings up these other kind of contradictions that I'm trying to actually explore, because so on one hand, and a major part of the ethos of this show is we are in a global world both by objective reality and by aspiration. We are internationalists, and there's synchronized struggles. They're not the same. I love Zizek's distinction about you have the local and the particular, and then you find the universal through that versus imposing a universal. But of course there's universal subjectivity. Of course there's shared bounds of an experience, and there is literal political interdependency. I mean, ecology is the most obvious example, but across every area, all of these struggles matter and are connected, and that's also a beautiful fruition of a socialist vision, frankly.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, there is a deep yearning right now for community, for connection, and sense of finding oneself in space. And this is this Bruno Latour book that I've been referencing a lot, where he talks about coming back down to earth, where literally like globalization is an imaginal project. It's a fantasy life that is incompatible with like the literal ecological base upon which we all live. And then the magical thinking about technology saving us from those limits gets more and more intense. And not to say technology won't play a role, but it's not going to save us. Like there isn't going to just be like, oh, we figured out how to upload ourselves onto the cloud and now pollution doesn't matter. Like that's not going to happen. And so what I'm trying to say though, but then there's like that other tendency of like, okay, but then of course we see this rise of nationalism and xenophobia and intense cruelty and discrimination and the resurgence of that. And so we object to that and fight against that correctly and in every regard. But then we cannot just throw away the fact that that might be a really perverse and delusional, because it's also just a fantasy. Like all of these authoritarian projects are still globalizers and extreme capital practitioners at the end of the day. But that human beings are seeking, like the healthy version of that is to actually know who your neighbor is and realize that you can't have a completely mediated life simply through technology. And then you would actually start to construct some type of dialectic between being a local, national, and global citizen. That I feel like that's what you're pointing to with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's underneath what I think you're saying is that the left needs to have an answer to people's alienation, and human beings yearn for connection, and capitalism has robbed us of our connection to each other, of our relationship to land, and wildfire focuses on really practical ways that organizations can build into their culture, things like song, things like ritual, things like being connected to the land that you're gathering on. And these things are not, you don't need to believe in any particular deity or God to participate in that kind of stuff. And that our basic proposition is that if the left gives away that stuff to the right, and in this moment when so many people are yearning for meaning, connection, belonging, interdependence, something to make sense of the fact that the entire, here's another way of thinking about it. Radicalization happens when you live an experience that's so different than how you've been taught to see the world that it forces you to change your entire operating story of how you understand the things around you just in order to make meaning of your life. And is the left offering people an answer to that? And, I think there's a generative agnosticism that the left can embrace, which is that, and this is honestly what psychedelics teach people. And I'll come out of my closet as a practitioner, an advocate of psychedelic medicines. And
oh my God.
Medicine.
I had no idea.
Can you believe it? And one of the things they teach us is like, no, none of us really have any idea of what's going on. and that I think what they've taught me is that some of the greatest leaps in the evolution of the human species happen when a particular social order bumps up against pressures that force us to give way into leaping into the unknown. And I believe that we're at one of those moments. Given the overlapping crises that we're in right now, people are so hungry to be rooted in something. And the whether it's eco-fascism or whether it's neoliberalism and the large spectrum of political positions between those things, from the center to the right, there are a lot of answers to those. There's a lot of meaning making happening. And unless the left learns how to do that, we are not going to answer the yearning that the human species is calling for when everything is constantly changing around us. And unless we can learn how to adapt and be humble, I think that's the other thing that these plant medicines, that these spiritual traditions teach us is to be humble.
Yeah. In the last couple of minutes, can you give us your version of a grounded reason of why people should actually feel some optimism?
Yeah.
Or no?
No, I can't. I'm actually, I'm an advocate of a very empowered apocalypticism. And, this last epoch that we've been in, this last world order has been rooted in slavery and genocide. This sort of arc of colonization that this civilization has been on has been barbaric, and there's been a through line all throughout it of widening the circle of liberty and this yearning for human liberation. And I was excited to see Harvey K on the chat for the episode today, and I think the way that he roots us, the way that you tune people into Dr. Cornel West's work helps us see that even in the context of all that barbarism, there's this deep yearning for human freedom, and that we have a choice of where we're going to root ourselves. And I think the left has a choice of, are you going to train your brain and the pattern recognition of the human minds to only see what's wrong with everything? Or are you going to train it through practices of gratitude, through practices of rooting yourself in a historical trajectory, to see this through line that actually is a shovel through which we can dig ourselves out, and to know that this world order is definitely coming to an end. This collapse is happening. We are part of a multi-generational arc that is the end of a world order. That's for sure. And what's not for sure is whether or not there's going to be justice through it. And I believe that our task is to learn how to take care of each other through collapse. And in the process, there are, as the old order falls down, there are so many opportunities that are open to us. And I think that's why the socialist left has a resurgence. I think that Naomi Klein's work on that is really helpful. And it's given us, it's the biggest opening for socialism that certainly we've had in our lifetime.
There's no question about that. Joshua Kahn Russell, I really appreciate you, man. I appreciate you as a friend. I appreciate you as a thinker, as a leader. Wildfire Projects do really important work. And Joshua, it's awesome that we get to work with you on TMBS. I really appreciate your time, man.
Love you, homie. Love the complexity that this show grapples with, and love the fact that we can talk about spirit from a materialist perspective. And if I can just give a quick pitch, since it's the end of the year and some people might want to donate to support movement building, if you go to
Empowered Apocalypticism, go.
Exactly. We don't have time to fuck around.
No, we don't.
Or to screw around. Sorry to curse on the...
No, it's all right. It's late enough in the show. We don't have the luxury of cynicism. I feel like Obama when I say that. We don't have the luxury of cynicism. All right, Wildfire Project, go.
You know, the nonprofit industrial complex doesn't fund movement building very well. And we sustain ourselves based on grassroots donations. And if you can go to wildfireproject.org/donate, you can see from our website all of the movements that we serve. We support cutting edge frontline organizations in a variety of different sectors. And now is such a good time to become a sustainer of our work and be in tune with it. We'd love to share more with you. And you can join our list on our website. Thanks.
You can do it. Do it. It feels good. And it's incredibly important work. You talk about rent strikes in Minnesota. You're talking about labor organizing across the country. You're talking about the rights of migrants that actually go back to the original wars that are the preset of Trumpism. So this stuff is incredibly important. Joshua, thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
Appreciate you, man. Thank you. Seriously, check it out. It's an awesome project, and Joshua's work is super important.
It's a good first live video interview.
Yeah, well done, guys. We pulled off the tech as a little treat for the audience, especially if you're hitting us with super chats. Let me do an impression of. Let me pretend that didn't go well. I can't see him. Where is he on the screen? So empowered apocalypse, what does that mean? God damn it! If I do ayahuasca, will the tech work?
Probably.
If I do magic mushrooms, will there not be a problem on the feedback? I'm getting too much feedback. Will psilocybin help me with that? I always wonder, actually, because there are definitely people at this point who watch and listen to this show that are not familiar with the Majority Report. I always wonder where they're like, why are you doing a aggressive Jerky Boys voice in the middle of this very august content?
I feel like we've cultivated an audience that is willing to roll with things.
They're really,
Like, oh, this is a bit that I'll have to, figure out over the course of 3 weeks.
That is definitely a transmission that I've got from Sam, which is like the most insulated layer comedy making ever. It's like, no, this was a joke that happened 5 years ago that we were actually doing off mic, and then you heard a third of it on mic, and then it's been repurposed for a clip that we actually didn't play that I'm doing on another show. But you'll get it.
Right Wing Mandela is based on something Rick Santorum said on CNN on a CNN hit. Like
6 years, 7 years ago. Actually, it's based on two things. There's that, and then there was Chris Matthews. There was a period. Chris Matthews was begging Obama for months for an interview. He's just like, "Why won't he come on my show? Barack Obama, please come on my show. Barack Obama, please. I have so many questions I want to ask Barack Obama." And finally, Obama agreed to give Chris Matthews the interview. And on that day, Nelson Mandela died. And it was like, oh my God, Mandela did this to fuck Matthews. Or it was just, they were like, Madiba, the interview has been agreed upon. And he was just like, well, my friends, it is time to say goodbye. Actually, the first version, there was Mandela, because Rick Santorum compared the fight against Obamacare to the struggle against apartheid. So that was just like, exactly, this is what will Robben Island, because a voucher system for private health care is apartheid. Rick is absolutely right. And check out my new website, fightforthefamily.comusa.org, where you can get on our mailing list and find penis enlargement pills. But then the Chris Matthews one, it's a whole other direction we could have gone in, where Mandela was actually like a media critic. Because that was basically just him dunking on the MSNBC lineup. It's like, and Chris Matthews, another Tip O'Neill story, really? Oh, wow, Rachel, there's a city council race you knew about in 1977. Jesus fucking Christ. And this is supposed to be the liberal network? Just like Mandela is like a disgruntled nation reader. I remember when the left actually meant something. Now it's all just to sell BMWs and paranoia. It's actually not bad. That might be a decent evolution of the character. All right, let's do the gem, and then we'll do the shout out. Gem time.
Let's do it.
And actually, matter of fact, you're going to have a lot of responsibility over the shout out this evening, David.
I'm ready.
So this is a very, very, very high stakes couple of blocks for you.
Oh,
it's a big deal, frankly.
Well, this is a big deal. Well,
Yes.
you know, we're sort of hitting the end of the year, and I just wanted to hit something that came across my desk recently, which is that global debt just hit a record of $255 trillion in 2019, which is very exceptional. Just
setting records everywhere.
Everywhere. Just for reference, you know, in 1999 it was 83.9 trillion, and in 2009 it was 186.6 trillion. So again, this is, you know, the combination of private non-financial sector debt, government debt, and finance, right?
I have a whole list of accomplishments that the group behind me have done in terms of this administration and this Congress, but you've heard it before. Pretty much. All over the place. Records all over the place. And that will continue.
But you have heard it before, because this is something that we've been building since the financial crisis, which is basically, you know, we decided we have this massive financial crisis, and the idea was just to make money really cheap and to try to pump money into the economy. So our economy right now is fueled by debt, and that economy originally was run by finance, which got us into the crisis in the first place. So, you know, this certainly, especially like a finance-based economy, certainly inflates certain assets. That's a big part of why housing's so expensive, because if banks are able to basically lend very cheaply to everybody, then, you know, you go and bid, and then someone else gets a higher bid, and it just naturally pushes the price up of all those assets dramatically. So while we're also seeing this massive amount of debt in, you know, for households in the financial world, we're also seeing, you know, a massive increase in, you know, public sector debt. Now, of course, not all debt is the same, and the public sector can arguably use this debt to create use values, actually like directly creating things that we use, and that's something that can be very positive. But we should also remember that debt is a way to enforce control, as we've seen within the European Union and with the IMF, to be able to force you know, countries to implement certain models. It also can allow, especially for smaller nations that take a lot of like private debt, it's a way to you know, impose capital strikes on these countries. Now, the reason this is important is because, you know, the fundamental crisis of capitalism has never been solved. It's just been constantly moved around. We talked last week about, you know, the inflation crisis under Volcker, and the movement toward a more like finance-driven capitalism in the United States and the UK. You know, this is just another way of moving around this crisis. We see what happens. We have stagnant wages, and we just have increased credit. You know, student loan debt is ridiculous, $1.5 trillion. And let's also remember that, you know, people of color are really burdened by this, and they're most likely to default. Also, business debt is growing exponentially. U.S. business debt exceeded that of households for the first time since 1991. You know, this is something that is increasing, you know, at an unprecedented rate, really. And, you know, this is what happens when you have a society that basically the only model for growth that we have is to unleash finance. We've been told this lie for generations now, that the market will sort itself out. If you just increase the amount of financialization, it will make the economy more efficient. The opposite has happened. We actually have a very complicated society now that is almost completely divorced from any real production. Meanwhile, as this is going on, we're actually facing a massive deindustrialization crisis, not just in the United States, and this is something that a lot of people have been missing, but across the globe. In Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, Peru, South Africa, South Korea, the Middle East, all across the world now, we're seeing this massive deindustrialization. So it's not just that capital is moving, you know, into different countries to create low wage jobs over there, capital is actually, industrialization is declining across the globe because we are facing something that Marx talked about a lot, which was one of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which was the crisis of overproduction. We haven't seen increases in output growth across the globe in a very long time, and that means that any kind of productivity increase that we get from machines really, really hurts working class people across the globe. There's no way that capitalism is going to be able to get itself out of this crisis. All it's done is continue to move the crisis around. We really need to start talking about creating a radical new economic system. There's a lot of things we can do in the short term to help people out, but until we get out of this system, we're going to be in an endless system of constant crisis, constant debt, and constant pain.
We need to graduate.
That's it, yeah.
We do. I mean, I think the language of post-capitalism is both more... It's smarter strategically and in a certain sense more accurate because we don't know all of the models, obviously. Like, we do know different parts. We know labor power. We know some elements of worker cooperatives. We know some of these things. But, and also if you read Marx, these were certainly open questions. I mean, the critique, like something like the critique of the Gotha program and the potential limits of a social democratic arrangement with capitalism is there, although that's already modified by Engels moving forward and when it becomes like actually more of a real possibility. But that being said, like, we actually know that critique and we experience that critique and there's truth to that critique. And then the second part of like, what does this actually look like? I think we know pieces of it and fragments of it. I don't think it's something that's still being prototyped.
Well, I think at the same, exactly. And, one thing that capitalism has done is it has, in a lot of ways has created, production lines that interact with the entire globe. There are like, for example, like finance, even like the shareholder company is like a potential way to have shared ownership of things. And I think it's really important too that we continue to hit on the fact that, the crisis we're seeing right now is actually like a crisis of overabundance.
Right.
And that's what gives us the model. Now, there's a lot of things that we're going to need to do, right? Because we can't live in a consumer society if we want to survive on this planet anymore. We cannot continue, strip mining the earth, right? But our ability to produce the amount of, human needs that are necessary to survive, we already have that capacity. The question is the system the one that is going to be able to, give us what we need? And it's not. It's failing dramatically for the vast majority of the population.
Well, it's creating scarcity where there's abundance.
Exactly.
And it's treating where there's actual limits as being abundant.
Exactly.
And that is producing ecological and social needs crisis.
So moving past that is the goal of our movement, and that's why some of the plans that Bernie Sanders is doing. We talked to, unfortunately Labor didn't win, but some of the parts of the Labor manifesto are sort of pushing us in that direction, and that's where like the hope can come from analysis, actually seeing that there are movements to radically change the way that we interact with each other, interact with the world, and interact with their economy.
Absolutely. Well, I would say you cleared the first mark pretty well, David. Are you ready to lead through the first shout out?
Yeah.
Are you ready Are you ready to do the shout out? Can you do it? Matt, where's the song? Shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain's still in recovery mode.
Shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain is still in recovery mode.
Shout out, shout out.
From taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Shout out, shout out.
From taking in so many high-level important ideas. The dial of ideas. I like talking about ideas. High level. The exchange of ideas.
Shout out, shout out.
High level. Still in recovery mode.
Looking forward to sharing more ideas.
David, what do we got, man?
Yeah, well, also, shout out to Joshua who let me know about this very exciting action.
The great Joshua Kahn.
That just happened in the Bay Area. Something we've talked about a lot, and is another good example of recognizing the failures of our current model and trying to push us into the next one. So I wanted to shout out the activists who blocked the entrance at PG&E's headquarters and have demanded that Governor Newsom take over the utility as a public good.
Yes.
It should be noted that many activist groups were a part of this action, including disabled people and racial justice advocates. And just quoting from the NBC News story on this, dozens of activists blocked the entrances to PG&E's corporate headquarters in downtown San Francisco on Monday morning, demanding that the utility company do more to protect people from power shutdowns. This is a quote here. People with disabilities, young people who have survived fires in Sonoma County, and black and brown folks have locked down the building, demanding that PG&E can't go about business as usual. Business as usual has meant people's lungs, people's lives, people's homes being taken, said coalition member Pete Woolwood. Now, PG&E, as we know, has been found to be a horrible company that's very much responsible for some of the most devastating fires in the region. They are also responsible for horrible abuses in maintaining their system that cause people to actually lose their lives. Their failure to be able to provide power to people has been devastating, especially to people who have medical equipment that runs on electricity. I mean, this is an absolutely devastating company, and a company that continually it's supposed to be run privately, right, so that it increases its efficiency, but constantly they are raising their prices, and people in that area are actually paying some of the highest prices in the country for a service that is not only not working, but is literally killing people. So these, activists and so many people have been calling for this to be brought into public control rather than its current system where it is a, for-profit company.
Excellent. That's the shout out. David, that was acceptable. No, well done. I'm just kidding. I've always wanted to say that. If I was a professor, I would be such a bastard. But actually low key, probably super easy grader.
Oh yeah.
I would put on my syllabus that 50% of grade was class participation, meaning if I like you or not.
Those were the best professors.
Oh, class participation professors.
Oh yeah.
I would look when I would see that syllabus, especially when they really got into trying to justify it. How you talk is a major part of your career. I was like, oh hell yeah, dude, definitely.
The best were the ones who have you petrified the entire semester that you're going to fail. They come off as a really hard grader, and then they give everyone extensions for months. I had a philosophy professor who people would turn in papers a year later, after the course.
A year later, that is a stretch.
Because he was a comrade,
Right. You can manipulate comrades a lot. I remember actually one of the my Marxist professor was I came in. He gave it it was ridiculous. It was a 20-page theory paper. By the way, it was a great class. Shouts to Professor William Corlett. He's the reason. There's no way I would have read Capital on my own. I read that whole fucking book because of that class. And so we had several for undergraduate actual theory papers that we had to write in the semester. And then we were graded on verticals, which was one was actual theoretical contribution and then reading comprehension essentially. But the last one was we had a 15 or 20 page paper due, and then an open book exam within 48 hours. And I went in to meet with him to ask him about something, and he was just I don't know what's wrong with you guys. You guys should have totally shut me down, because that's a ridiculous expectation. But you didn't join together as a group, so so you're screwed. I was what the fuck, man? Can I have an extension?
It's incredible.
Yeah, I came up with a liberal answer for myself, which was getting an extension. All right, we got a couple of stories we're going to get to. First, let's play a couple of clips. Glenn Greenwald just interviewed Evo Morales in Mexico. Evo is actually going to be going to Argentina, where he has been given refuge by the new Argentinian government. And, I mean, look, these are why these blocks matter. It's very important that the Fernandez-Kirchner government is in power right now for a variety of strategic reasons for left viability across the hemisphere. I would recommend everybody watch this whole video. I'm not sure yet. Glenn might be coming on this show to be talking about it. But I want to play a couple of clips. The first clip is Evo explaining the coup process to Glenn Greenwald. And again, there's people who still complaining about this to me. And I'm honestly dumbfounded. It's a coup. You can, I literally, it's weird to be the pedant here, but these things actually have meanings. The military said to leave. It's called a coup. You know, in Egypt, the Morsi government, there were millions of people. There were more people protesting Morsi than the original uprisings against Mubarak. And it was a coup because General Sisi took power in the country, circumventing democracy. Now, all arguments defending this have been knocked back to, he said he was running for a 4th term, man. Because the OAS, you don't hear about that report anymore, do you?
Yeah.
Do you hear about that OAS? I don't hear about that OAS.
Not at all.
report.
And it took them, how long did it take them to release their final report? I mean, almost like a month now. You know, compare that with the 3 days that it took them to push forward these like very inflated claims about election fraud in Bolivia.
And what did the final report say?
I mean, it did not.
It did not say that this was a stolen election.
Yeah, exactly. Think about that for a second too. With almost a state apparatus now in Bolivia that's completely, you know, wanting you to make this accusation for them, and you know, giving them everything that they need to make that conclusion if they had the ability to do it.
So we have an election where Evo Morales wins a 4th term. There's no credible allegations otherwise. I'm sure there's irregularities, although frankly, when you hear irregularities, you either need to enlarge, like there's irregularities in the United States. In fact, there's mass voter suppression in the United States. So, and that's a problem everywhere. But when you get to a point where you were saying literally, this is a reversal of a voting outcome, that has never been credibly argued in Bolivia by anybody. Then you get to 4th, you know, he's running for a 4th term. Well, okay, the one example is there isn't a big meltdown about Angela Merkel, who's been in office longer than Evo Morales, right? And then the other one is, I'm not impressed by term limits arguments. If you can go out and win, you win. I don't, like, the guy won. And the only critiques, as always in these situations, that come from Evo Morales that are valid are people on the left who don't support this. And if you can point me to people on the left who support this, the term astroturf was invented for a reason. I'm talking about people on the actual left connected to social movements who might have had a critique. They did not want him to be deposed, have the military ask him to leave. And I guess apparently when you are asked, it does not make it a coup because it's polite. And then have a giant, massive Bible carried to the Congress. The empowerment, and you'll hear about one of them, of far-right religious squads across the country, terrorizing the base of Evo's party. There's been mass killings, empowerment of military and police. That is a coup. You can have a critique, you can have a conversation, but you can't dodge reality. This is Evo Morales talking with Glenn Greenwald about how that coup took place.
First of all, President Morales, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today. Ever since November 10th, there have been numerous reports that the Bolivian military suggested that you resign the presidency and leave the country. You have said that what happened was a military coup, that you were forced to leave the presidency. Can you tell us exactly what it is that the military and the police did and said?
Las elecciones nacionales se realizaron el 20 de octubre. Al día siguiente, 21, el partido perdedor Carlos de Mesa pidió a sus militantes a movilizarse, convocó a movilizarse para rechazar los resultados de las elecciones nacionales. Sobre pretexto de fraude, y en la noche del 21 de octubre empezaron a quemarse tribunales electorales departamentales. En toda Bolivia, en 5 departamentos quemaron durante la semana. Ahí empieza el golpe de Estado porque la Policía Nacional no da garantías, seguridad a tribunales electorales departamentales, pero también las actas de sufragio de las elecciones del 20 de octubre. Pasaron la semana, desde Santa Cruz, Comité Cívico Cruceño a la cabeza de Camacho, piden renuncia, movilizaciones, paros. Resistimos hasta el día 8 de noviembre. 8 de noviembre, primero la policía se amotina y se suma al golpe de Estado.
Sin embargo, no podemos quedar indiferentes ante nuestra sociedad.
El día 10 en la madrugada, la OEA también se suma al golpe de Estado. Finalmente, el día 10, las Fuerzas Armadas dicen que renuncie. Sin policía, sin Fuerzas Armadas, la derecha movilizada, no hay ninguna seguridad. Por tanto, para evitar más derramamiento de sangre, renunciamos con compañero Álvaro García Linera. Hermanas y hermanos.
So that's what happened. Basically, he explained how essentially paramilitary forces were mobilized in wealthier, more kind of Spanish-identifying regions of the country, would be my understanding. Then there was mass mobilization. The OAS put out this report that was misleading on election fraud, to say the least, if not outright dishonest and supportive of opposition forces. And then he lost the police and the military, and then you have a coup. I think I'll close the loop before we get to the second clip here. I think that, again, this is another one where people need to start having really serious conversations about strategy here, because in Venezuela, they have been able to see off a coup by totally co-opting the military, which means definitionally some problems, okay? Like, that's not great from a state building perspective or a narco perspective or whatever else. But the bottom line is they have preserved their government from a US-backed far-right coup because they have the military. Now, Evo, contrary to all of the endless melodrama about him, and again, there are some valid criticisms from the left and from indigenous people, but the truth is his record is won 4 elections, cut poverty by more than half, and strengthened Bolivian institutions across the board, and even won respect from like places like the Financial Times on his macroeconomic management. Then, of course, you have the infamous Lula example, where the guy lifts 30 or 40 million people out of poverty, is a relentless support. I mean, this guy is out there in Brazil right now saying we're going to respect Bolsonaro's mandate, even as first of all, it's an illegitimate election because Lula is a political prisoner and taken off at the playing field in an election he would have won. And secondly, as Lula is putting forward, he's talking about the connections between this government and the paramilitary complex in Rio de Janeiro. So this is another conversation that people are going to have to be a lot more honest and rigorous about what it actually takes to maintain power in the hemisphere from relentless and constant U.S. interference and local oligarchies. And this speaks to the second clip where, and I think that this is broadly true. I am someone who does not believe in making stupid false equivalencies between the two political parties, because in the margins of those differences are millions of lives, whether they're dreamers or funding levels for SNAP, and those things actually matter. When it comes to foreign policy, there is a profound continuity. Now, on the flip side, for people who get delusional about Trump because occasionally he says anti-war stuff or whatever, this is a message for you too. Because the Trump foreign policy is the next extension of empire. And this is Evo Morales talking about what foreign policy looks like in the hemisphere from the United States, Bush, Obama, and Trump.
No solamente un golpe de Estado interno de los bolivianos y bolivianas, de las oligarquías bolivianas, de algunos miembros de las Fuerzas Armadas o la policía, sino una conspiración externa. Mi delito, mi pecado, ser indio. Y segundo, como movimientos sociales, haber nacionalizado los recursos naturales, quitar las transnacionales, hidrocarburos, tema de minería, pero además de eso, haber reducido la extrema pobreza con programas sociales. ¿Sabe? Detrás de este golpe de Estado estaba transnacionales, Estados Unidos, por tema del litio.
Lithium has become incredibly important for electric cars both in China and the US.
Se sabe muy bien, la ciudad de Potosí, un grupo de cívicos empezaron a cuestionar la industrialización del litio. Bajo una licitación pública internacional, se adjudicaron ser socios, algunos prestar servicio, China y Europa mediante Alemania. Ya empezamos la industrialización, ya estamos exportando cloruro de potasio. El próximo año tenemos que inaugurar carbonato de litio que produzca 350.000 toneladas al año. Tenemos plantas pilotos. De este proyecto energético, que es futuro del mundo, que esté fuera de Estados Unidos, Entonces yo sigo convencido, este es un golpe de Estado al litio, pasando un golpe de Estado a Evo y a todas las políticas económicas.
That's a slightly different clip than I thought, but that actually, it's on a similar theme. In another clip, he said that there is a continuity, maybe not stylistically, but between the kind of core foreign policy initiatives across administrations, and that would connect to what he's alleging there, which, by the way, like, whether or not we will determine more and more what actually happened here in the coming months and years, obviously. But if you don't think that that's a valid interpretation of what happened in Bolivia, one that I happen to totally believe, I'll be transparent, you're delusional. You don't know your history. That this is the story of that region. It's a fucking coup in Guatemala over bananas. Literally. I mean, Banana Republic actually has this is a banned word in the style guide of the show, but it has a problematic origin. And it has to do with countries that we set up right-wing death squads to run so United Fruit Company could have a high margin on its bananas. You better believe lithium is going to be something that's going to determine a lot of geostrategic action in the future. And he set up a situation where they got to cut. I mean, that's really the bottom line. They got to cut. There's going to be a partnership. The government's going to get something, and it's going to be distributed.
It's tough, though. Evo has the demeanor of such a bloodthirsty tyrant.
Doesn't he? I know. He's very, very intense, very vicious guy. We're going to talk actually about this Pentagon budget in the postgame. We got a bunch to get to in the postgame, so we're actually going to go to the postgame in a minute. Tomorrow, a little bit of a schedule change. We are off for most of the week, but we're doing a Monday show on the 23rd, last show of the year with Professor Richard Wolff. He's coming in studio. We're going to be talking about Marxism, and David's not here, so we're going to talk a lot of shit about David. Professor Wolff sent me he said, look, is that little prick at least on vacation? And I said, he is, Professor Wolff. Geez. And he said, great. I'll be there early. So he will be here. Yes, Matt?
Well, I think he's auditioning to take over the Griscom Economic Minute.
There has been a lot of suggestion that he would like to take over the gem. He also told me that he could do the Shoutout as well, which is why I piloted a pilot run on that tonight.
Look, I won't be worried. I'll be face first in a beef rib at Terry Black's barbecue.
Yeah, it's just like he said he'll enjoy the barbecue and I'll be at the Bell House. So we're gonna do that. We'll have we're gonna continue to have Sunday episodes the whole time. Upcoming episodes include one on what eco-fascism is exploiting in our political moment and potential answers to that. Then a think tank, which is always a lot of fun. And of course, next week's show, Monday. Become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. Check out the new website, tmbs.fm. Grab your gear, grab your tickets to the Bell House. Thank you to everybody who makes this show possible. Appreciate all of you. We'll see you in the postgame.